Hello, this is Dr. J. Davidson from drjdavidson.com. I'm excited to welcome you to this very special segment of the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit number 2. According to the CDC, there are more people affected with Lyme disease each year than breast cancer. Today, my special guest is Scott Forsgren, and we're going to be exploring casting a broad net to maximize Lyme disease recovery. But before we do a little bit about Scott Forsgren is the founder of BetterHealthGuy.com, a health coach, FDN practitioner, certified Klinghardt ART practitioner, health writer, advocate, support group facilitator, conference moderator, and Limelight Foundation board member. He recovered his own health after a 20-year journey through Lyme disease and mold illness. He has been interviewed on Lyme Ninja Radio, Lyme Less Live More, Beyond Wellness Radio, Essential Medcast, the Autism Recovery Telesummit, and on the first Chronic Lyme Disease Summit as well. He has lectured on his recovery from chronic illness as an invited speaker of the Klinghardt Academy and at Autism One. Today, Scott is grateful for his current state of health and all that he's learned on this life-changing journey. Scott, welcome to the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit number 2.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Dr. J. This is fantastic.
Well, I'm excited to have you on here again. And I say again because we had you on Chronic Lyme Disease Summit number 1. And I think you're maybe, besides myself, obviously being on as a host again, I think you're one of 2 people that are back for repeats. So that's a huge compliment for you.
It's an honor. It's an honor. Thank you so much.
So, diving in, can you give our listeners a little background on your Lyme journey?
Sure. So for me, it started in 1996 here in Northern California, where we reportedly don't have Lyme disease, or at least that's what people still suggest. I did have a tick bite several months later. I 1997 got really, really ill. Literally now it's been 20 years, which is hard to imagine. But at the time I had no EM rash. No one ever suggested Lyme was even a possibility. It really started several months after the tick bite with what seemed like a really, really significant flu. Flu times 100. It was one of those things that was so bad that I wasn't really sure if I was going to get through it. Had never experienced anything like that before. Probably some of the most significant things were head to toe burning sensations. And I had those for years. That really was the worst part of it, the neurological pain. It really felt like a sunburn around the clock throughout my entire body. It was one of those things that at the time, literally you would just kind of cry yourself to sleep at night with lots of fear and anxiety and pain and not really sure where this was all going to go. At the time, I couldn't get up and walk across the room without feeling like that was my task for the day. I had these weird balance issues, even sitting up in a chair or even lying in bed, where I felt like I was going to roll off the bed and had to, be propped up with pillows and things, which was really concerning, obviously. And then if you looked at the list of Lyme-related symptoms, I had most of them. So, there's probably 300 or more symptoms of Lyme. Most of them at one point or another I certainly had. It took about 8 years and over 45 doctors to finally get someone that first even mentioned Lyme as a possibility. And that came in 2005 after I was sent to someone who did electrodermal screening, also known as EAV. It's a form of energetic testing. And that practitioner suggested that I go back to the doctor, get tested for Lyme and co-infections. And later the blood work did confirm Borrelia as well as Babesia, Bartonella, Ehrlichia, and a host of other vector-borne or tick-borne infections. So for me, I was very fortunate that after 8 years of really struggling that I managed to get to someone who did this energetic testing, which at the time seemed really odd to me coming from a high-tech background. I didn't really understand it. But had it not been for her, I could have gone for many more years with the labels that I had been given, which was chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia and those types of things, and maybe not gotten closer to a root cause. So that fortunately was very life-changing for me. And today I'm doing really well. I continue to focus a lot on health optimization, but I have not thought of myself as having Lyme disease for several years now.
Wow. 8 years and 45 doctors it took before Lyme even came up as a thought.
Yes, absolutely.
Wow. So this EAV, is that the electrodermal screening type machine that you originally
It is. EAV is electroacupuncture according to Voll. Voll was a German doctor in the mid 1900s, and there's a number of different systems that people use today, things like the Zyto or the Asira. I'm also very drawn to a system of muscle testing that Dr. Klinghardt has created called autonomic response testing. But yeah, it was one of those devices that actually was at an outlet mall next to a coffee shop that this doctor had sent me to work with this lady, and went through a couple hours of testing. And when she came up with that at the end, I kind of thought, okay, this was really bizarre. I didn't really buy into it at the time, but thank gosh, it was the thing that led me to going back to the doctor, getting the testing. And then the interesting thing is the doctor who had referred me, once we got confirmation, he said, it's really interesting. You have many of the symptoms of Lyme disease. I have a huge number of Lyme patients in my practice, and for some reason, I just didn't connect the dots. And so, fortunately, he got me to the person that was able to help us connect the dots. And so for that, I'm really grateful.
Wow. From mess to message or pain to purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
So with your journey, did you continue using the EAV or energetic testing after it determined that you had the Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia?
I did, and I still do, actually. I fairly quickly after the diagnosis in 2005, January 2006, I was front row at my first Dietrich Klinghardt conference, probably driving him crazy at the time with my hand raised throughout most of that weekend. And so his system is called autonomic response testing. That's a manual muscle testing based system, but it's just been absolutely fantastic. So I tend to use ART now to guide my health more than anything. I still work with some practitioners from time to time just for maintenance that also use various forms of energetic testing, including the autonomic response testing. And so, as a group, the energetic testing has really been a phenomenal set of tools. It's helped me to explore things, beyond Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia, and to really, the topic of my discussion today, to really cast a broader net and find all of the things or many of the things that are kind of roadblocks to optimal health, and really to then improve the overall outcome in my experience. So I definitely owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Klinghardt. He's just a fantastic doctor and human being, and really changed my life, not only with the autonomic response testing, but also with the framework that he puts together, the 5 levels of healing and the 7 factors to kind of move people towards a better understanding of what they need to do. But yeah, to your question, the energetic testing absolutely has been the tool that I found to be the most helpful. And it's probably the one that, I would have believed the least a decade ago. And now I definitely have benefited tremendously from it.
Yeah, how we grow through trials and tribulations, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So you mentioned Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia. One of the speakers, Dr. Evan Hirsch, he's like, I'm thinking about I created a new word. He called it Bortonesia, where it's Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia all together, because he feels like it's such an important role. Do you feel like those 3 are the key to treating somebody or focusing on those to get somebody well of Lyme?
It's an interesting word. I've heard Dr. Neil Nathan and Wayne Anderson referred to Babinella as well, with Babesia and Bartonella. I do think that the 3 Bs are certainly important things that we need to explore those. We probably aren't going to optimize health if those are present and we don't do something. And I do think that Bartonella and Babesia, for many people, are probably even more significant than Borrelia itself in terms of the symptoms that they produce. And I would say that most of the time when someone has Lyme, that the co-infections do play a role. I think it's very, very uncommon that someone has Borrelia alone and doesn't also need to explore Bartonella, Babesia, and a number of other things. So I think that, we need to explore things beyond Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia, but I do think that that's part of what we need to look at. I think if we focus on the 3 Bs, we could do that for the rest of our life and still not make any significant progress from a health recovery and optimization perspective.
Are there a bunch of other microbes or pathogens that you feel play a big role besides just those 3 then?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long list, but I think the rickettsias, things like Ehrlichia and Anaplasma, Mycoplasma and Chlamydia, which are very, very common in people with vector-borne illness. And unfortunately, those are things we can get fairly easily re-exposed to as well. So I think those are some of the more common bacterial issues that people think of related to vector-borne illness. But it's not just bacteria. So there's also the fungal organisms, the viruses that we all carry. Parasites are often a very common issue as well. And I think it's not so much about the bugs. It really comes back to the terrain. And once our terrain is such that these bugs are able to be hosted, then everyone pretty much moves in for the party. So bugs certainly create symptoms, but I don't think that the bugs are the primary issue that we need to address. And if we look at, there is some debate, but I've read people that have suggested that our human cells are outnumbered by microbial cells by a factor of 10 to 1. Some recently have said maybe it's more 1 to 1. But either way, I think there's as many of them or more than there are us. And so I think we have to kind of step back a bit and look at the broader picture rather than just focusing on all of these different microbes. And also just from a perspective of the way we approach it from a mental perspective, I don't think we necessarily want to approach recovering from Lyme disease as a battle. I think that's kind of a bad mental place to be. I think we need to look at it broadly, but not necessarily approach it so much as a battle.
Wow. Such great thoughts. Yeah. Just even the framework that we think of it. Yeah. Not as a battle. I love that, Scott. And the terrain, I mean, when you're saying terrain, I'm hearing focus on the person more than just the bug. Is that what you're kind of getting to?
The person, yes, but I would say by terrain, I'm primarily thinking about all of the toxicities that we're exposed to, the metals and chemicals and pesticides, and some of them I'm sure we'll talk more about in this discussion. But really, what is it that's kind of allowed these microbes to move in the first place? And so, yes, the entire person holistically, but also really, I think the focus on detoxification is really probably the most important thing we can do to improve health.
Okay. And you're talking about besides just the bacteria, fungi, viruses. You know, I've heard the 10 to 1, I've heard the 1 to 1 ratio that you mentioned as well too. And then I feel like ever since that medical medium book was published, you know, viruses are getting talked about more, Epstein-Barr, the HHV, and different things. I've heard recently that viruses actually outnumber our gut bacteria like 10 to 1. So I'm not sure who gets to count and estimate, but
Yeah, and that's the challenge. I mean, I think they all play a role. I do think Epstein-Barr, HHV6, all of the viruses that we carry, I think they certainly are something we need to look at and support and work at supporting the immune system. So for me, it always comes back to just not getting too much of a tunnel vision when we're approaching Lyme disease and identifying and removing as many of the roadblocks as possible. I think that's the best way to improve our health.
So if there's certain... I mean, is your focus when you're working with individuals or, I mean, in all the experience that you have in the Lyme, I mean, do you still have to kill bugs? Or, I mean, when you're talking about casting a broad net in terms of Lyme disease, I mean, what does recovery look like?
So I would say that the first thing is that a strategy that really attempts to get health back by primarily killing organisms. There certainly are people that their idea is that they can kill their way back to health. And I don't think that that's a long-term winning strategy. I think there are just as many people out there that have had exposure to tick bites or other sources of Lyme-related organisms that have never felt sick a day in their life and that they never actually manifest Lyme disease. So I think we have to focus as much or more on the terrain that we talked about as we do the bugs. I don't think that you can focus on just killing microbes as a primary strategy. And I also think that we do need to have some part of our treatment protocol giving attention to the microbes that are there in the case where there's an overgrowth of certain microbes. But I do think that that's fairly low on the list. And even in Dr. Klinghart's teachings, the actual microbial piece is really the last thing on the list. I think we have to focus on things like what is our diet, what is our gut health, how do we improve leaky gut, detoxification we talked about, the mental emotional health certainly plays a role. What are our stress levels? What are we doing that's driving up cortisol, that's impacting our immune system, modulating the immune system, which is really important as well because a lot of the symptoms of the microbes are not necessarily from the bug, but it's really how the immune system is reacting and interacting with that bug. And then another aspect, of course, is working on reducing the microbes, but I don't think that that's at the top of the list at all. So in my experience, focusing on the microbes while not doing a lot of these other things doesn't get people to where they'd like to. But if they can do a lot of these other things while also having an antimicrobial aspect of their treatment protocol, I think that's really where the gold is.
I couldn't agree more, Scott. I don't know if that's why I like talking to you, is think so similar, or you just honestly, for all the listeners, I mean, you have such an amazing website, so detailed on the different conferences with Lyme disease. I think it's just such a great reference. So definitely want to encourage the listeners to check out betterhealthguy.com. Speaking about your bio, you mentioned Lyme and mold illness for 20 years. Where does mold fit into the picture?
So I think there's, if we step back and talk about casting a broad net, let's maybe talk a little bit about the things that I think are areas that we need to explore, and then mold certainly being one of those. So if we take the Lyme piece off the table, I think the other things that we need to explore that can certainly be holding us back and making us feel unwell are things like mold that you just mentioned. I think that's an absolute number one, top of the list thing that has to be looked at. In my experience with Lyme, I used to talk about Lyme all the time, and then having been impacted twice by mold illness now and seen what that's done to my body, I actually think that my bigger problem over the years was the mold and not the Lyme. So I actually put mold as a higher priority now than Lyme. We also need to look at things like heavy metals and pesticides and chemicals. I think EMFs and EMRs I also think of as environmental toxicity. Parasites are a big factor as well. So the protozoa, the worm-like parasites. There's a whole lot that needs to be explored around dental issues. So things like mercury amalgams, root canals, dental cavitations, nutrition around, what are we eating? What's our diet? Are we eating reactive foods? I think that's another area we need to explore really is gut health. I think that's far more critical than what most people give attention to. I think it's very, very important. And then the emotional mental health as well. So those are some of the bigger ones. And then if we kind of dive in a little bit to mold specifically, I would say there aren't any perfect tests that I've seen for mold. It is absolutely at the top of my list of things I think everyone that has Lyme disease needs to explore. If you are getting exposed on a daily basis to something that is your kryptonite in your environment and you're getting mold exposure, not only the mold, but the mycotoxins, the VOCs, the other bacterial and other organisms that are at higher levels in these water damaged buildings, it will, in my opinion, at least absolutely be an uphill battle, and everything else that you do will be much, much more challenging and much harder to make any real progress. So I've certainly seen people that have struggled with treatment for Lyme. They address their mold issue, and then suddenly there's just not the same resistance in terms of their treatment and their healing path. Things just start working better. They start making more progress. And a lot of times they can make more progress with a far less aggressive treatment protocol. So maybe they were doing really aggressive antimicrobial things. They identify mold as a factor, and then the things they can do from an antimicrobial perspective are seemingly small, and yet they're still making more progress because they're not getting that mold exposure on a regular basis. And if we look at some of Dr. Richie Shoemaker's work, it's about 25% of the population that has a genetic predisposition to developing a biotoxin illness from a water damaged building. So if you're in that 25%, then about 50 to 70% of the buildings in this country are estimated to be potentially problematic. So it's a huge number. And I would say in the population of people dealing with Lyme and biotoxin illness, it's probably much higher than 25%. That's in the overall population, but in the sick population, I think it's higher than that, certainly. And so doing the genetic testing, which is called HLA-DR testing, that I think is often very helpful. I do recommend it. It is unfortunately pretty common that people will have some predisposition to mold, and actually, you can have a predisposition to Lyme or to mold or to other things that are a little less common. But commonly, mold, you either have a direct mold predisposition or there's what's also called multi-susceptible HLAs, and those also are susceptible to mold. So many people have a mold predisposition, and that's why I think it's really, really critical to explore. I think for those people that are dealing with Lyme, they should absolutely do an ERMI, which is an environmental relative moldiness index. The company that I've personally used is called Mycometrics, and that's the one that Dr. Shoemaker uses as well. So I think that's an absolute first step as someone's working through this Lyme disease recovery path. And then I also do occasionally like doing some plate testing where you can get the plates, put them out for 1 to 2 hours, and you see what grows on them, and then you can send them back into a lab. There's one called immunolytics that I've used, and Dr. Neil Nathan talks talks about that one as well. And so it's just another way of the two. I think the ERMI is certainly the one I would do first, but the plate testing is inexpensive, and sometimes that can give you some additional information as well. And then if both of them happen to come back negative, then I think that's a really good thing. But these tests aren't perfect. So we also just have to, explore the environment. In some cases, hiring a professional mold inspector, or what's called an IEP. Sometimes that's really the only way to go, and have them come in and through years and decades of doing this kind of work, a lot of times they can do testing that's much more advanced, and they can, even sense or smell or pick up things, use different types of technologies and things to explore, humidity, water damage, and whatnot. So part of the challenge, though, becomes that it's not just the home environment. A lot of times people's home environment is fine, and it's their work environment. Very commonly, I would say it's the school environment. And then sometimes people are fine in their homework and school, but maybe they have a mold issue in their car. So any place where you spend regular, consistent time, I think, is a suspect at the beginning. I would say home, probably, since that's where we spend maybe the majority of our time, is where I would start. But then you have to at least give consideration to the other environments as well. Another test that Dr. Shoemaker has talked about over the past couple of years that can also give some insight is called the Neuro Quant, and that's an MRI of the brain. It's looking for certain patterns of atrophy or swelling, essentially, that are consistent with mold or Lyme, and it's another piece of information. I think when it comes to mold, the more we can explore, the better. If we don't find something, then that's fantastic, and I would say that generally speaking, when mold is not part of the picture, people's recovery is much more straightforward, and they tend to recover much faster than when mold has been part of the picture as well. And then there's one other test out there that I personally found very helpful. It's a little more debated. This is a lab in Texas called Real Time Labs, and they look for mycotoxins in urine. And in my own experience, I had essentially zero mycotoxins in my urine prior to getting another exposure in 2015 for a long period of time. I redid the testing. I showed very, very high levels of 4 different mycotoxins at the time. I did some additional focus on treating. I left that environment, and then that test normalized. So for me, it did correlate. There are certainly some people that still debate the usefulness of that test, but I do think it's helpful for some people. One of the challenges is Dr. Shoemaker has recently really been emphasizing that mycotoxins are still a very small part of the picture in a water damaged building. So as low as 1% of the overall problem. So it's another indicator, but it's still, like I said, there's still not any perfect tests out there. So I think we really need to use multiple different ways of looking at things and trying to get a clearer picture.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from you, Scott, is if you're in a moldy environment, you want to remove yourself from that.
You absolutely have to remove yourself. I mean, that's for sure the number one step. I would say that in some cases, remediations are successful. And at this point, I would say more people probably go down the remediation path than actually moving, but you have to address it in some way. And, once you find some indicator for mold, then I think, the next things people can do is, first, I would look at the survivingmold.com website. Dr. Shoemaker has a tremendous amount of work. He's got several books on the topic, Mold Warriors, Surviving Mold, and others. And then I also really there's an ebook that Dr. Neil Nathan, who's one of my mentors, and I think a fantastic doctor as well, he's got a book called Mold and Mycotoxins, Current Evaluation and Treatment 2016. It's about $8 or $9 on Amazon. It's a short read, but it's very, very detailed and kind of goes into how he approaches mold. And then he and I also did, in conjunction with Dr. Wayne Anderson, we did an article for the Townsend Letter that's also available on my website. Goes into detail on how they approach mold illness. It's a couple years old now, so they're constantly adding new things, learning new things, but it's still a good resource. And then another one that I found recently that I really liked also is there's a really great free guide on mold from Dr. Jill Carnahan, who I just love and have so much respect for. She's amazing. And so if you just Google Jill Carnahan free mold guide, you'll find that as well. And she personally had experiences with mold in her practice and puts a lot of the resources that she found helpful together in a document that you get from her website. So I would look at that as well.
And plug here is she's a speaker on the Lyme Summit #2 as well. So check her out.
Yeah, do check her out. She's fantastic. One of the people I just love and admire. So essentially, I would say, as you mentioned, the first step is always to identify and eliminate the source of the exposure. So that could mean remediation. If it's a minor issue, some people may get by with, adding some good air filters, IQ Air, Air Oasis, whatever their preference is. It may mean a combination of remediation and improving the air from, air filters. And the air filters are doing lots of things. It's not just the mold or the mycotoxins. I mean, there's other things, VOCs and things in the environment that I think the cleaner the environment can be for those people that are recovering, the better. In some cases, yes, I think people do have to move. I moved homes once and I moved work environments once. And so I've been through it. I've thrown lots of my stuff away. I know it's stressful, but usually once people get through the trauma of making that big decision and move to a safer environment, their health oftentimes very significantly improves and they look back and say, gosh, I should have done that, much earlier. So if someone's not in a safe space for healing on a daily basis, I think everything else, it just becomes so much more challenging. The value of doing that is more limited. And once you either remediate or move and get out of the environment, then the next step is to start introducing things to help the body get rid of the toxicity that it was exposed to while you were in the environment. So binders are one of the primary strategies to remove those mold toxins from the system. Dr. Shoemaker talks about the use of cholestyramine and Welchol. I think cholestyramine can be a miracle for people that are dealing with mold. It's not always well tolerated. Most people can usually do it if they, manage their dosing and maybe not do the full amount. And there are other strategies for making it a little bit better tolerated, but it can be really, really helpful for people, especially earlier on once they've gotten out of the moldy environment. And then longer term or in combination, I also like other binders like Takasumi Supreme and Zeobind from BioPure. Those are two of the ones that I found to be very helpful. And then in addition to the binders, you kind of have to explore other things like what's going on with that specific person. Do they have staph in the sinuses or what's called MARCONs? What lab abnormalities do they have? So do they have issues around antidiuretic hormone or MMP9, C4A? They may have elevated transforming growth factor beta 1. Those are all markers that Dr. Shoemaker looks at in the biotoxin illness realm. And so a lot of times the steps then have to kind of be customized based on the abnormalities that a specific person has. And then there's also a lot of really great papers on the survivingmold.com website. So they have a physician certification program now. And one of the things as part of that certification, as I understand, is the doctor that's being certified has to kind of write an essay about how to approach recovering from biotoxin illness. And so there's very detailed papers from many different people's perspective as far as how you go through the Shoemaker protocol. So I think those are a phenomenal resource. And then oftentimes in the Shoemaker treatment protocol, then something called VIP, which is a nasal spray. It's vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. That's kind of the last step. It's kind of the reset for the overall biotoxin illness, or what's called CIRS, which is chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So VIP is the last step in the pyramid of Dr. Shoemaker's protocol. And then there's other people like Joe Brewer and Neil Nathan that also consider the possibility that if you've been exposed to these organisms for long periods of time, that they may colonize in the sinuses and in the gastrointestinal tract. And so in that case, then another layer to this whole process is potentially using different nasal antimicrobials and even systemic antimicrobials to reduce any colonization of these organisms. And that's kind of where the Shoemaker approach and the Joe Brewer and Neil Nathan approach differ. And I think people, really need to find a good doctor to figure out what the best path is for them. But that's another consideration in this whole mold illness puzzle as well. And then, like I mentioned, I think having a clean ERMI in hand, it should be the first thing anyone with Lyme has to just rule out this whole mold thing before they start their treatment. It needs to be a first step. I wish I had done it much earlier. Unfortunately, I had gotten diagnosed with Lyme right around the time that Mold Warriors came out. So a lot of these things really, 10, 12 years ago, a lot of these things really weren't in our consciousness yet. I don't think anyone was treating Lyme, or I don't know of anyone that was treating Lyme that was also really looking at mold very much at that time. So I've seen a number of people that have struggled for many years with Lyme only to find mold was a bigger picture. And I believe in conversations that I've had even with Dave Asprey, who lots of people probably know, he had Lyme for many years, and I believe he would say the same thing now, that mold ultimately was the bigger piece of the puzzle as compared to Lyme. So when mold's an issue, I think it's best to address that before starting a lot of other treatment. As I mentioned, it just creates less resistance to healing overall. And then one more thing maybe on mold that I would mention is if people are interested in learning from other practitioners that do this work and focus on it on the podcast that I do on my website. I also just recently had Dr. Sandeep Gupta on, who's the SIRS shoemaker certified practitioner from Australia. So that was a lot of fun to kind of learn about what's going on in Australia and his own experience with mold illness. And then John Banta, who's an IEP or one of the environmental inspectors, talking about how he evaluates a home. So lots of good information there, and those could also be good resources for people.
Wow. My notebook is filling up with notes, Scott.
You know all this stuff already.
Well, I take notes though. This is great information, and it's also, if you're feeling overwhelmed, it's okay. That's why it's good to listen to interviews like this multiple times, because you'll keep getting more and more information. And my personal take is pick one thing and start moving forward with it. Get the Lyme Summit number 2 for your library, so you can come back to this and, keep progressing. But when you're talking about mold, Scott, I just keep thinking about my wife, and since I've known her now for maybe 13 years now, there's been 2 really big crashes, I would say, or three big crashes. One of them was after the birth of my daughter, which I think that just set everything off. But the other 2, I know for a fact that there was mold that basically was there that then triggered right. The downward spiral. So,
yep. Yeah, me as well. I mean, I was doing really well and got into a place that had mold over a period of time. And the first thing people often notice is just the inflammation often gets worse. And then any of the symptoms are worse when we have higher levels of inflammation. So I think even from the perspective of some of the labs like C4A and whatnot, as a person gets back into a moldy environment, it doesn't take very long. I mean, minutes or hours oftentimes before people start seeing rises in some of these biotoxin illness markers. So I absolutely agree with you. It's so important.
Yeah, just great points though on mold. Definitely take home things. Switching gears and maybe a little bit more selfishly, because I feel like parasites can be a big piece of this puzzle too. What's your thoughts on parasites in this whole mix? You mentioned them a little bit earlier.
Yeah. I mean, my biggest thought is they are here in the United States. There's so many people still that say, you see intake forms and they say, well, what's your travel history and whatnot? And sometimes that's really important, but not if someone says they haven't been out of the U.S. and then the practitioner assumes that they don't have parasites. There's plenty of parasites right here. There's been various studies of salad bars in major cities and other things that show parasite eggs and things of that nature. So they don't have passports. They definitely come in. It's probably more of an issue now, even just with globalization and how easy it is with international travel and whatnot. So I think people absolutely need to think about parasites. The challenge with parasites is the testing. I would say there are not any really great, very highly sensitive tests for parasites. And so I tend to like to use multiple different tools. I do like the energetic testing that Dr. Klinghardt does with the ART. I also, over the years, have really grown to like Dr. Raphael D'Angelo's testing with Para Wellness Research. He's just got some fantastic testing. He looks for parasites in both stool and urine. He's doing a number of things, but really himself looking under a microscope at the stool for different parasites and parasite eggs and protozoa and things of that nature, and has a really high percentage of samples where they find some type of parasite. I believe the first testing, it's like over 90% where he finds some kind of parasite. I've done it a couple times myself. I did find some parasites with his testing. I've gone through some of his treatment protocols, and so eventually I'll do some retesting there to see if there's anything still showing up. I think we get ongoing exposures to parasites as well, depending on what we eat, our level of hydrochloric acid, and so on. So it's not a one-time thing and then it's done. Other things that I do like for testing, I think there's labs that can be helpful, like BioHealth, for example. The 401H is a good tool. Diagnostics has a great GI health panel. The GI Map, which is a microbial assay plus, is also another test that's kind of recently come into my circle of people that I connect with and has also been helpful for people with parasites. And then there's certainly other labs out there as well. I like Dr. Simon Yu in St. Louis is another practitioner that I have a lot of respect for. He does a lot of different types of energetic testing. He's got a great book called Accidental Cure, which I highly recommend. And I believe he's working on a second book now as well. And so I had done some work with him years ago, also identified some parasites and did some treatment at that time. And it's interesting that, people talk about deworming their pets, their dogs, their horses, all of those things, but somehow we just don't do that in humans. I don't know if it's just a disgusting factor or what it is, but we just kind of seem to ignore it. And so if you look at Dr. Klinghardt, Dr. Yu, and others, it's one of the top areas that they explore in trying to improve health in a chronically unwell person. And so, and it's also explored very, very early in treatment. So similar to the mold piece, I think the parasite piece is something that needs to be looked at early on. And then another thing, kind of circling this back into the whole terrain concept, Dr. Klinghardt talks about how parasites are often present to concentrate heavy metals. So rather than having these heavy metals kind of floating around freely in the body doing damage, that parasites and fungi, for example, also do this, like Candida, but they both can concentrate or hold on to these heavy metals so that they're less damaging to our body otherwise. And so that also then circles it back around to the idea that the more we can detoxify and reduce the level of toxins in the body, then potentially the less likely parasites will be over time if we focus on the terrain as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about it from that standpoint. It's almost as if the parasite's absorbing the heavy metals and trying to protect the body to some degree then.
Absolutely.
Huh. Yeah, it just makes you think. And I couldn't stress more the frustration I've seen with parasite testings. I swear I had one client went to the bathroom and there was literally a worm that she sent in with the stool sample and it still came back negative. And I was like, I'm losing faith in parasite testing.
Well, and I've heard that several times as well. And someone that suggested that they have to put the stool on a slide to look at it under the microscope. And so they have to scoop out all of the bigger things to be able to actually then put it on a slide and analyze it under the microscope. So maybe that's one of the reasons why they didn't identify it.
Let's just get rid of these big worms. Now let's see if we can find any little ones.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's say parasites are a piece to the puzzle. Where do people go as far as treatment-wise to clear these parasites out?
So I think there's two different ways people can go. Ideally, combining them, I think, is best. There's certainly natural options. There's also the pharmaceutical options that come from, the work of Dr. Simon Yu, for example, and the work of Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, which is based on Dr. Simon Yu's work. I mean, Simon Yu, his story is really interesting. I believe he was a colonel in the military for many years. And when people were in the military hospital with these unclear illnesses, he brought in his acupuncture meridian assessment tool and started screening people and identified that pharmaceutical antiparasitics were the things that were balancing their meridians. And so he started treating them with these pharmaceutical antiparasitics, and many of them got significantly better. And it was kind of funny. I asked him at one point, how did you bring in an acupuncture assessment tool into a military hospital? And he said, well, I was the colonel. No one was going to tell me not to. so it was pretty awesome. But I think there's those two paths. There's the pharmaceuticals, things like ivermectin, biltricide, Alinea, Albenza. There's certainly others. Dr. Klinghardt, I interviewed him recently, and he suggested that the parasites seem to become less responsive to the pharmaceuticals alone over time, and that now his approach is to always combine pharmaceutical options with the natural options. I think if someone's not drawn to the pharmaceuticals, personally, I do like some of the pharmaceutical antiparasitics, ivermectin and Alinea particularly, but some people are not drawn to do the pharmaceuticals, and so there's plenty of natural options out there as well. I like, there's a number of them actually, but I like Beyond Balance has a couple of products. One for protozoa called MCPZ, another one called Parazimin. BioPure has a suppository of garlic and artemisinin called Nexus Suppository. There's herbs like mimosa, which are available from different companies like BioPure and Supreme Nutrition and others. And then other products that I occasionally have found helpful. Jernigan has one called Paragen. There's Botanifuge. Bioray makes a product called Artemisia and Clove that I really like. So there's a lot of natural tools that we can use as well. And sometimes, like I said, combining them with the pharmaceuticals is a good strategy. And then Dr. D'Angelo, who I mentioned I had done his protocol, he uses combinations of oral essential oils combined with oral herbals and does that over a period of several months, very specific days of the month relative to the moon cycle. I think it's a well thought out protocol. And so essential oils and herbs also play a role in the treatment of parasites. And then a lot of times doing an initial course of treatment and then coming back to doing maybe a week before and after the full moon for a period of a few more months, because that tends to be when parasites are a little bit more active or in a cycle of replication. A lot of times people will feel their symptoms flare around a full moon. And when that's the case, for me, that's kind of a clue that parasites should be investigated. And then I also like the idea of there's a number of homeopathic which I think of kind of as frequency or energetic approaches, and a number of those things for parasites that I think can also be layered in. There's things from companies like Picana, Viatrex, King Bio, and others that just kind of add another layer by providing that homeopathic or frequency support at the same time.
Excellent. Yeah, just take notes, folks. Take notes. This is great stuff. So mentioning, heavy metals accumulate in parasites, and to begin the detoxification process, what are your feelings about detoxification? Like, what are the best tools or your views on it?
The most important thing I would say is do it every day. That really is. Detoxify every day. So I think it's, as we talked about, it's a more important long-term strategy than killing bugs. I personally do something every single day, and I will for the rest of my life, because I think if we didn't have some either less than optimal genetics or the reality is more epigenetic influencers in our modern environment that cause the genetic expression to be less than ideal is maybe a better way to say it. But if we didn't have these issues around detoxification, then we probably wouldn't express symptoms at all. So I would say that most people dealing with chronic Lyme have some impairment around detoxification combined with a more toxic environment as compared to many years ago. And so there's really two main categories of things that I like to use. The first one is binders. We talked a little bit about that. And then the second is either homeopathic drainage remedies or herbal organ support remedies. And so for the binders, Takasumi Supreme, Zeobind is another one that I really like. Cholestyramine we talked about. That can be great if people are dealing with mold toxins. And then the real important piece of the binders is that as these toxins are being concentrated in the bile and the gallbladder and then released into the gastrointestinal tract, oftentimes because the body wants to conserve the bile, they get reabsorbed in what's called enterohepatic recirculation. And so the real point of these binders is to try to bind the toxins to something that's not going to get reabsorbed so that they then get excreted out of the body. And when you're dealing with something like Lyme, I think everyone should have an aspect of their protocol on a daily basis that includes some kind of binder. These things need to generally be taken away from other supplements and medications, and ideally away from food as well. So sometimes finding the right time to do it can be a little tricky, but it is very important. And then the drainage options are things like Picana has a great line of products. I think they call it their Big 3 detoxification kit. Things like Apohepat, Renalix, Iteres, and Mundipur, which is support for liver, kidney, lymphatics, and Mundipur is a little more general systemic drainage and extracellular matrix. I love those products. And then there's other similar products from companies like Energetics, Physica Energetics, Deseret Biologicals, a number of those kinds of tools. And then the herbal support for detoxification can also be phenomenal. So probably my favorite, certainly in my top 5, maybe my favorite product of all time is one called Liver Life from Bioray. That's a really good support for liver and kidneys. I've used it a lot myself, and certainly with other people that I've done some coaching with, and it just seems to be a great tool for detoxification. And then I also, besides just things that you're taking on an oral kind of basis, there's other tools that I think can be fantastic. Things like coffee enemas, definitely high on the list of things. Fortunately, I don't do them too often anymore, but when I was in pain and had lots of inflammation, they were certainly one of the things that helped the most. Far infrared saunas, with the caveat that not everybody's ready for them. If you're not sweating or you haven't supported your adrenals adequately, you may need to be a little cautious with that. The ionic foot baths, Dr. Klinghardt is a big fan of those. I do one twice a week. Things like the biomat or the pulsed electromagnetic field mats, I think those can also be supportive of detoxification. Castor oil packs, just kind of working these things into your routine. So I try to do, one of those a day, just different ones, rotating it into my schedule. Some of them are easy to do while you're just sitting there watching TV at night. It's not like it takes a significant amount of my time away from doing other things. And then I think another really critical part of the whole detoxification, which I should have mentioned first, because I actually think it's more important, but looking at everything you eat and drink and inhale and put on your skin and put on your hair and all of those kinds of things, and really minimizing the toxins in the first place so that we have less to detoxify. And I think it's logical that if the toilet's already overflowing, generally you're going to turn off the water. And yet when it comes to toxicity, a lot of times people are doing things to detoxify, but they're still exposed to toxic cleaning products and, a host of other things. So I think we need to look at those too. And then, unfortunately, we also have the electromagnetic fields, which I would say those are environmental toxins as well.
So for detoxification, in other words, don't let it keep overflowing like the toilet. Basically flush your toilet then. Get the stuff out that's overflowing and causing inflammation.
Right, exactly.
So I'm hearing so much about mold and detoxification, more so than necessarily the bug. When you talk with individuals, talk with colleagues, do you think that surprises the general public about Lyme?
I think it does, actually, depending on who they're working with. If you're working with someone who's more integrative, alternative, naturopathic, I think it's then not quite so surprising. But I think there's lots of people. I've talked to many people over the years that were doing aggressive antimicrobial treatments for Lyme. And when I ask, what are you doing for detoxification? Sadly, they have kind of a blank stare and they're not really doing anything. So, yeah, I think it's new to some people. And I think it's really important that they explore it.
Yeah, I would agree, because our environment, unless we literally live in a bubble and maybe the bubble's made of plastics, then you're still exposed to plastic and phthalates. And
right.
And then we all mentally stress ourselves out. So we all have that toxicity, I guess, as well, too. But our environment, we share one atmosphere, meaning that things that are done on the other part of the world still affect us, and there's going to be exposure. So I love the focus about that. As far as EMFs, what do you do about those? It seems as if more and more people have a cell phone. Kids have cell phones. Where does the EMFs fit in?
EMFs are actually, I think, some of the harder things to control. And I was just talking to someone earlier this week who's really exploring and researching EMFs. And I'm constantly open to learning new things. Dr. Jack Kruse, who's a neurosurgeon, has talked a bit recently on some of his podcasts about the 5G network coming online and how that has more direct impact on the mitochondria, which is concerning. I think, we're getting more and more exposure. So personally, I do have a case on my phone. I use the Pong case, but there's other ones out there that I think are helpful as well. I don't have any, and a lot of this comes from Dr. Klinghardt, I don't have any cordless phones in my home. I never hold the cell phone to my head. I probably haven't done that in 15 years or longer. I have the Wi-Fi router in my home turn off at different times of day when it would be impacting me, so that most newer Wi-Fi routers, you can actually go in and put a schedule so that it's automatic and it turns on and off at different times of day. I do also have Stetzer filters in the office that I work out of at home. I have a silver-lined Faraday cage that I sleep in at night. That's also one of Dr. Klinghardt's teachings. And so unfortunately, I think this is a problem that's getting worse and not better. And so our tools for minimizing exposure have to also become more and more of a consideration. I think a couple other things that tie in here: when someone is heavy metal toxic, they seem to also be more sensitive to electromagnetic fields. So I've seen people that had a smart meter installed on their home. They felt burning, on fire type sensations in their skin the minute the smart meters got installed. And by aggressively addressing heavy metals, they were able then to tolerate that environment. So that's a consideration. And then there's other systems that I'm in the process of exploring. I don't really have a final thought yet, but things like DNRS, which is Dynamic Neural Retraining System, where people have been able to retrain essentially the alarm center of the brain or the limbic brain, such that if you can get the limbic brain to stop responding in a stressful way when it doesn't need to, that people then seem to be less sensitive to these electromagnetic fields. So Dr. Klinghardt also in a recent interview on the podcast that I did with him mentioned that we're doing about as much as we can do to minimize the exposures coming in, and that another thing that he often recommends for people is to take certain things orally that also support the body against the electromagnetic fields. And two of the ones that he most commonly uses are propolis, which is a nice, well-rounded, broad-spectrum antimicrobial as well. Propolis, I would say, is one of the tools that I actually do like quite a lot. And then rosemary is another tool that also can help minimize the impact of electromagnetic fields on the body. So we need to combine these things that minimize exposures, but then also potentially incorporate some things that make the body less impacted by those electromagnetic fields.
And rosemary, like the essential oil or herb or either?
Herbal tincture generally. So BioPure, for example, has one. There's other companies that have them. And I believe Supreme Nutrition also has a Rosemary Supreme product. I don't know if they specifically talk about it for EMFs, but I know Dr. Klinghardt does talk about rosemary for kind of fortifying the body against some of the effects of the EMFs.
Wow. Such great information, Scott. I mean, as we're wrapping this up, I can only imagine listeners maybe have some overwhelming feelings right now just of all the different pieces that to some degree need to be addressed. And I think the more they need to be addressed, the more severe the case is. What final words or thoughts do you have for listeners?
So I would say don't be overwhelmed by it. I mean, it sounds overwhelming, and it is, but this is information that I've picked up over many, many years. Find a practitioner that you feel you resonate with. That practitioner should be able to provide you a lot of guidance. This is not something you necessarily have to understand, and you certainly don't have to understand it all at once. And I think there's many, many layers to this, and so don't be overwhelmed by it. It's definitely a marathon and not a sprint, and teaming up with a good practitioner that's familiar with a lot of this information, I think can really, really help. Yeah, I think that's it. Just don't be, I know it can be overwhelming, but it's taken a while to kind of figure out all these pieces, listen to other speakers on the Chronic Lyme Summit, listen to them more than once. There's lots of good books that have come out recently on Lyme as well that really put things together nicely. And so people definitely do get better. I think there's lots of hope out there. There's lots of new information, new tools. And so I think it's really actually a very positive time that we're really starting to understand these conditions much better, and lots of opportunity for healing.
Yeah, well, great. Well said, where you said this has been years of you learning. So don't expect to understand everything just from listening to Scott one time. Definitely revisit it. I want to thank you so much, Scott, for taking time out of your schedule to join me on the Chronic Lyme Disease Summit #2.
Thank you so much, Dr. J.
Well, it's been a pleasure, talking with you, Scott, and just having you unload the information for our listeners. And as you've heard from Scott, if you feel like you've done everything, you might not have. There's a lot of pieces to understand. And it's important with Lyme disease and other mysterious illnesses that we look at the body as a whole holistically. And Lyme is more than just a tick bite. So definitely take this life-saving, life-transforming information home with you by clicking on the banner beside or below, and share this with your friends and loved ones. This is really a great interview to give you a great overview, like he said, casting a broad net. And don't forget to visit Scott Forsgren at betterhealthguy.com. He's got some great podcasts, tons of information. You talk to people in the Lyme world, and I feel like they've all been to his website and read his information. So check it out, betterhealthguy.com. You will not be disappointed. Maximum blessings. This is Dr. J. Davidson.